close is America to seeing domestic unrest turn into something resembling a battlefield? That was the chilling question raised in Chicago when a protest outside the Immigration and Customs Enforcement headquarters spiraled into a night of chaos, violence, and arrests. What began as a morning demonstration ended with shattered glass pepper balls hissing across the streets and sirens wailing through downtown. In a city already scarred by decades of tension between federal authority and community distrust, the weekend's confrontation became a striking reminder of the fragile line between civil protest and urban unrest. Witnesses described scenes that looked less like civic dissent and more like open conflict bottles and stones hurled at government vehicles, tires slashed, and fireworks ignited against the backdrop of steel barricades. Officers responded with dispersal tactics, shields, pepper ball launchers, and barricades designed to contain and divide. 16 arrests were confirmed, yet the damage extended far beyond numbers. Hospitalizations from chemical spray vehicles immobilized, and public anger deepened the wound between law enforcement and parts of the community. Analysts warn this is not just a Chicago story. In Washington, President Donald Trump has already reinforced his stance that federal property will be defended with every tool available, hinting that further escalation could invite National Guard deployments. But this raises new questions in neighborhoods already hostile to federal enforcement. Would military presence calm the situation or turn the city into a flashpoint for wider confrontation? History suggests the latter. Past deployments from Ferguson to Portland inflamed tensions rather than reduced them. Adding to the concern, international observers note how such unrest echoes global trends. In Europe, NATO capitals quietly track these domestic clashes because they test America's resilience at home, while its forces are stretched abroad. With US troops committed to deterring Russia in Ukraine, monitoring Iran's escalating shadow war with Israel, and maintaining deterrence against Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, internal instability risks weakening the credibility of American authority. A NATO defense analyst in Berlin recently warned a superpower under strain at home cannot lead effectively abroad. Chicago may be a local crisis, but it carries global resonance. The parallels are striking. Just as Ukraine fends off Russian aggression with drones and precision strikes, or as Israel confronts Iranian proxies with advanced missile defenses, the United States faces its own test not against foreign missiles, but against the legitimacy of its federal institutions. Security, whether on the battlefield or on American streets, ultimately relies on public confidence. Lose that, and adversaries from Moscow to Beijing will take note. The clash in Chicago revealed something deeper: the limits of force as a stabilizing tool. Law enforcement claimed their actions were defensive, measured against escalating violence. Yet rights groups accused ICE agents of intensifying the conflict through indiscriminate use of chemical irritants. The debate mirrors global security dilemmas. When does deterrence protect, and when does it provoke for America? This is no longer an abstract question. If protests around immigration enforcement continue to erupt across major cities, how will Washington balance the shield of security with the promise of civil liberties? Will aggressive enforcement restore order or fuel a cycle of unrest that adversaries abroad will exploit as a sign of weakness? Can a city street become a proving ground for modern tactics of control? In Chicago, the clash outside ICE headquarters revealed how federal strategy collided with improvised resistance, turning a single protest into a textbook case of urban confrontation. SHIELD teams advanced in disciplined lines, pepper ball launchers hissing through the night air, while demonstrators crouched behind makeshift shields of plywood and metal, responding with bottle stones and even fireworks. Each side moved like players in a grim chess match, adapting moment by moment as the balance of control teetered. For law enforcement, the priority was clear, contain, divide, and disperse before the unrest spread into downtown Chicago. Officers erected steel barricades, used rooftops for overwatch positions, and coordinated shield pushes to reclaim space inch by inch. Their approach mirrored the layered defense tactics seen in counterinsurgency zones abroad, where authorities aim not to destroy an enemy but to break its momentum. Officials later described their methods as defensive, insisting their force was proportional to the threat. Yet protesters were no passive crowd. Tire-slashing vehicle blockades and constant recording on cell phones transformed the demonstration into both a physical and digital battlefield. Every pepperball burst was filmed, every scuffle live-stream, fueling narratives of resistance and repression that spread far beyond Chicago's streets. Analysts compared the imagery to flashpoints in other democracies: Paris during the Yellow Vest protests, or Berlin during recent anti-immigration rallies, where the camera lens amplifies the street clash into a national reckoning. Critics argue that the tactics deployed blurred the line between control and escalation. The National Lawyers Guild accused officers of firing indiscriminately into crowds, intensifying the conflict rather than de-escalating it. Several protesters required hospital treatment for chemical exposure and impact wounds. When dispersal feels like punishment, the crowd grows more defiant, observed one civil rights attorney, highlighting the dangerous cycle of crackdown and retaliation. Internationally, such images have weight. Russian and Chinese state media have already amplified footage of American unrest, framing it as proof of a divided nation unable to govern itself. In Moscow, military commentators noted the irony of Washington preaching stability abroad while facing scenes of riot police under siege at home. In Beijing, outlets suggested that America's internal fractures undermine its credibility in the Indo-Pacific, where U.S. naval forces currently shadow Chinese maneuvers near Taiwan. For seasoned military analysts, the Chicago events reveal a deeper lesson. The tactics of control must be paired with strategies of legitimacy. Urban unrest, like insurgency, cannot be quelled by force alone. Without addressing root grievances, immigration tensions, distrust of federal agencies, and systemic inequality, each confrontation risks becoming a rehearsal for the next. A NATO security scholar put it bluntly: you can disperse a crowd with shields and gas, but you cannot disperse an idea. If mistrust remains, the conflict returns. As night turned to dawn, broken glass and scorched pavement marked the aftermath, but the bigger scars lay in perception. Supporters of ICE saw discipline and order, proof that federal power could hold the line. Critics saw brutality and excess evidence of a government deaf to dissent. The tactical clash became symbolic of a broader struggle, whether control is measured by territory secured or by trust preserved. And so the question lingers: are America's tactics designed to prevent unrest, or are they unintentionally rehearsing for a future where protests no longer end with dawn but ignite into prolonged urban conflict? What happens when the smoke of street battles drifts into the halls of power? The clash outside Chicago's ICE headquarters did not remain confined to broken glass and barricades. It quickly reverberated into Washington, igniting debates over law, order, and the limits of federal authority. President Donald Trump, addressing reporters from the White House lawn, warned that federal property will be defended with every tool available. His words were both a reassurance to supporters demanding toughness and a warning to critics who fear an authoritarian tilt. In Congress, the political divide sharpened overnight. Conservative lawmakers praised ICE agents for holding the line, with one senator suggesting that continued unrest in Chicago could warrant the deployment of the National Guard. To them, the 16 arrests signaled effective enforcement and the ability of federal power to impose order in volatile environments. But progressive lawmakers countered, fiercely accusing federal agencies of inflaming the crisis. They pointed to hospitalizations from chemical sprays and injuries from impact rounds as evidence of disproportionate force. The clash over Chicago became a proxy war for the larger national argument over immigration enforcement, civil liberties, and the scope of presidential power. Meanwhile, state legislatures began drafting their own responses. In California, lawmakers advanced a bill that would limit federal agents from wearing masks during arrests near schools and require public disclosure of federal operations in certain areas. Proponents argued this was necessary for transparency, especially for families in immigrant communities who fear sudden raids. Federal officials rejected the measure outright, citing federal supremacy. Legal scholars warned that these battles could soon test the Constitution itself, setting the stage for prolonged clashes between state sovereignty and federal authority. The timing is particularly significant. America is already under strain internationally, balancing commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. NATO allies watching closely see a parallel. Just as the US insists on the rule of law abroad, internal unrest raises doubts about its consistency at home. A defense analyst in London told Reuters, when a democracy projects strength abroad while looking fractured within adversaries will test its limits. The Kremlin and Beijing are already studying these fractures. The echoes extend further. During the Cold War, internal unrest in the United States, civil rights marches, anti-war protests were weaponized by adversaries in propaganda battles. Today, Russia and China exploit social media to highlight US turmoil, amplifying footage from Chicago to sow doubt about American stability. Israeli and European officials, locked in their own struggles with urban unrest, privately cautioned that America's reliance on force-heavy tactics risks alienating the very communities whose trust is vital to long-term security. Military experts also warn of the slippery slope of militarization. Once the National Guard enters an already hostile urban environment, their presence may not restore calm, but invite escalation. Past deployments in Detroit in 1967, Los Angeles in 1992, and Ferguson in 2014 show a pattern troops on the street often deepen mistrust, particularly in minority communities. You can win the night with force, but lose the decade with resentment, noted a retired U.S. Army colonel who served in Iraq and later advised on domestic security. The broader strategic stakes cannot be ignored. If America expends credibility in defending its institutions at home with heavy-handed measures, its moral authority to lead NATO and confront authoritarian rivals diminishes. How long can Washington demand restraint abroad while appearing uncompromising within? And perhaps more crucially, if unrest spreads to other cities, will America's political leaders escalate further or search for new solutions that bridge the gap between enforcement and legitimacy? When images of riot shields and pepper balls flood screens, whose side does the public take? In the wake of the Chicago ICE confrontation, American opinion fractured sharply. For some, the 16 arrests confirmed the necessity of federal intervention, proof that law enforcement still holds the authority to contain unrest and safeguard public order. Supporters argue that in a nation facing surging border crossings and transnational crime agencies like ICE are not political actors but essential protectors of security. A local alderman sympathetic to ICE told reporters, "This is not about ideology, it's about keeping communities safe." But for critics, the story is starkly different. Civil rights groups and community activists labeled the crackdown an assault on democratic freedoms. They highlighted footage of protesters dragged into vans and hospitalizations from chemical exposure as evidence of disproportionate force. In their view, ICE became not a shield, but a blunt instrument inflaming grievances rather than addressing them. On Chicago's Southside, interviews revealed deeper fears. Families already scarred by past raids spoke of children who live with constant dread of a midnight knock at the door. This division is not unique to Chicago. Across the country, polls show a widening gulf between those who prioritize strict enforcement of immigration laws and those who see enforcement as inseparable from systemic injustice. The timing once again matters. With President Donald Trump in the White House, immigration remains a polarizing issue at the center of national politics. His firm rhetoric resonates with voters demanding stronger borders and tougher policing, yet it equally galvanizes opponents who view his policies as eroding civil rights. International observers note how such polarization weakens America's ability to project unity. A European security journal recently commented that internal polarization over law enforcement mirrors strategic vulnerability, just as NATO requires cohesion to deter Russia and Ukraine, or as the US and allies must align to counter China's assertiveness in the Pacific. A divided America sends mixed signals. When citizens cannot agree on the legitimacy of federal enforcement at home, adversaries abroad see opportunity. The stakes are illustrated by parallel global events. In Kyiv, Ukrainian resilience depends not only on weapons from the West, but on maintaining national unity despite hardship. In Tel Aviv, Israel's ability to deter Iran relies on a population that believes in the legitimacy of its defense measures. And in Washington, legitimacy is tested when citizens question whether the use of force against protesters defends democracy or undermines it. A Rand Corporation analyst summed it up: the survival of democracies doesn't rest solely on armies abroad, it rests on the trust of people at home. Public opinion therefore becomes a battlefield as vital as any physical clash. Every cell phone recording, every news broadcast, every social media clip reinforces competing narratives. Supporters of ICE circulate footage of officers maintaining order, presenting them as disciplined guardians under attack. Opponents amplify images of injured protesters and aggressive dispersals, painting a portrait of unchecked state power. Both sides weaponize the same footage to tell entirely different stories, and in a media ecosystem driven by virality, those narratives shape perception more than official statements ever can. The enduring question remains: in a democracy, when force is deployed against protest, can the government maintain legitimacy with half its people convinced that justice has been abandoned? And if legitimacy falters, what fills the void, law or anger? What happens when a single night of unrest taps into decades of buried trauma? In Chicago, the ICE headquarters clash was not just about immigration enforcement. It was a spark that illuminated generations of mistrust, particularly in Black and Latino neighborhoods. For many residents, the sight of federal agents in riot gear echoed a long history of over-policing, discriminatory housing practices, and systemic neglect. Protest was not only about current policy, but also about wounds that have never fully healed. Community leaders describe the confrontation as the latest chapter in a story stretching back through redlining maps, aggressive policing in the 1980s and 1990s, and the militarization of federal agencies in the post-9/11 era. Activists argue that the IC standoff was simply another expression of a pattern communities treated less as citizens with rights and more as adversaries to be controlled. One organizer told The Guardian, "When you grow up with constant surveillance, constant suspicion, and constant fear, confrontation becomes inevitable. People react because they've been living under pressure for decades." This perspective sheds light on why the clash escalated so quickly. For those in the crowd, ICE represented not just immigration enforcement, but a symbol of state power wielded without accountability. The sound of pepper balls and the glare of floodlights revived memories of raids that tore families apart, of relatives detained without warning, and of children left traumatized. Sociologists warn that such generational scars deepen divides and make reconciliation harder with every confrontation. The trauma is not limited to Chicago. Across the United States, immigrant families live with what experts call anticipatory stress, the constant fear that at any moment a loved one could be detained or deported. Studies show that this fear harms children's educational outcomes and community cohesion. In cities with heavy ICE activity, trust in law enforcement is fractured. Residents hesitate to call police even in emergencies, fearing exposure to immigration enforcement. That erosion of trust leaves neighborhoods more vulnerable to crime, undermining the very security enforcement agencies claim to defend. Internationally, the Chicago events resonate with allies and adversaries alike. European observers recall their own histories of urban unrest, from Brixton in London to the banlieues of Paris, where minority communities clashed with police in cycles of violence and mistrust. In the Middle East, analysts compare America's domestic divisions to the way Israel faces unrest in Palestinian territories, where force alone cannot erase underlying grievances. For adversaries like Russia and China, these parallels are useful propaganda portraying America as hypocritical, championing human rights abroad while struggling to uphold them at home. Military analysts stress that unresolved community trauma has strategic consequences. A society divided against itself risks diminished resilience in times of external conflict. If Black and Latino communities feel alienated from federal authority, their willingness to support national initiatives, from military recruitment to emergency mobilization, weakens. In NATO circles, this is increasingly discussed under the concept of societal security, the idea that internal cohesion is as vital to deterrence as tanks and missiles. A fractured home front, they warn, is an open invitation for adversaries to test American resolve. The lesson is clear: unless the roots of community trauma are addressed through transparency, reform, and investment in social trust, each confrontation risks becoming not an isolated riot, but another stitch in a widening national wound. Which raises a difficult question: can America truly defend its global leadership while parts of its own population see federal institutions as an occupying force? What if Chicago's unrest is not just a local clash, but a warning signal for the nation? The confrontation outside ICE headquarters exposed fractures that stretch far beyond Illinois, cutting to the heart of America's struggle to balance security and liberty. In the immediate aftermath, officials touted containment, 16 arrests, damaged property secured, and operations inside the building resumed. Yet for analysts, the bigger question is not what happened that night, but what comes next. Federal officials framed their tactics as necessary defense, but critics warned that each heavy-handed response feeds the cycle of resistance. This is the paradox of control. When force is used to restore order, it may simultaneously deepen opposition. That dilemma echoes in other democracies, from France to Germany, where police crackdowns on protests often harden resentment rather than diffuse it. In the United States, with immigration policy already among the most divisive issues, the risk of escalation is magnified. Strategically, the implications ripple outward. America is not only grappling with domestic unrest, it is leading NATO against Russia's war in Ukraine, supporting Israel against Iranian proxies, and countering China's maneuvers in the Pacific. Allies watch closely because the credibility of US leadership abroad rests partly on its ability to project stability at home. A senior NATO official told DW, if Washington cannot manage its own streets without fueling division, it weakens its voice in shaping global order. For adversaries, unrest is an opportunity. Russian state outlets highlight Chicago's clashes to claim American hypocrisy, while Chinese media argue that America's internal chaos proves it unfit to lecture others on governance. Such narratives undermine US influence, especially in the global South, where nations weigh whether to align with Western democracies or emerging powers like China and Russia. The more America appears fractured, the more appealing alternative centers of power may seem. Military experts stress that stability cannot be secured by force alone. The Rand Corporation and independent analysts have long argued that legitimacy is the cornerstone of effective security. In Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. commanders learned that control of territory meant little if trust from the population was absent. The same lesson applies at home. Urban streets cannot be held indefinitely with barricades and chemical agents. What is needed is a strategy that blends enforcement with transparency, accountability, and meaningful engagement with communities. The path forward is fraught, but not impossible. Policymakers must weigh whether to double down on militarized enforcement or to pursue reforms that address the grievances fueling unrest. Options include independent oversight of federal operations, clearer communication about enforcement actions, and investment in community support programs. Without these, each protest risks becoming another spark, igniting not just confrontation, but a narrative of systemic failure. In the end, Chicago was more than a weekend headline. It was a mirror reflecting America's current tensions between federal power and community voice, between national security and civil liberty, between stability and legitimacy. The lesson for Washington and for President Trump's administration is clear. Defending federal authority cannot come at the cost of eroding public trust, or else the shield of security may one day become brittle. And so the nation faces a sobering question. If unrest grows, will America choose to meet dissent with understanding or with ever stronger force? The answer will shape not only the streets of Chicago, but the credibility of the United States on the world stage. The Chicago ICE headquarters confrontation of 2025 was more than a protest gone wrong. It became a national flashpoint exposing the fault lines between security and liberty in America. What began as a demonstration escalated into violent clashes marked by pepper balls, barricades, and 16 arrests. Law enforcement hailed their containment tactics as necessary defense, while critics decried disproportionate force and rising hospitalizations. The political aftermath stretched to Washington, where President Trump reinforced his commitment to defend federal property with every tool available, sparking debate over possible National Guard deployments. State legislatures like California advanced measures to limit federal enforcement powers, foreshadowing constitutional battles over sovereignty. Public opinion split sharply. Supporters praised ICE for maintaining order, while opponents viewed the crackdown as an assault on civil rights. In Black and Latino communities, the clash reignited historical grievances, linking modern unrest to decades of over-policing and systemic inequality. Strategically, the unrest carries global implications. NATO allies warn that domestic instability weakens America's credibility abroad, while Russia and China exploit the images to question U.S. authority. Ultimately, Chicago revealed a truth familiar to both soldiers and statesmen: without legitimacy, security cannot endure.